cell phones, or at least make them quiet.
All the discipline problems
Is
left.
that- I'll begin with a story, not really a story, it's something that occurred to me just last week. But it's always good to start with a story. And sometimes they're even true. This one is true. It happened to me last week. Someone called me up. This person is a very, one could say, real verbrente Eretz Yisrael, right-wing Jew. And he said to me, I feel every year when we celebrate Purim, I really feel that I don't know why I'm celebrating this thing. I'm celebrating an event that took place in Chutz La'aretz, in the Galut. Those Jews were in Galut, they shouldn't have been there in the first place, and after these events of Purim, they remained in Chutz La'aretz. They refused to come to Eretz Yisrael. And really, it doesn't have any real impact on Jewish history after the immediate events of those days. It's a non-event, and it's a Galuti event. It's an event rooted in the reality of exile, of Jews choosing to be in exile. And therefore, why do I have to celebrate this day? So this person asked me. And there are a number of points to be made regarding his question. First of all, we should mention the fact, that precisely because it is an event that took place in Chutz La'aretz, in the Galut, not in Eretz Yisrael, and that the Jews remained in that reality of Galut after the events of Purim. In other words, it didn't bring about a complete sea change in the reality of the Jewish people. For that very reason, we do not say Hallel on Purim. So says the Gemara, Megillah Bar-Hayim. It's discussed in Daf Yud Daled, and it's discussed other places. There are many midrashim that make this point, that we do not say Hallel on Purim, because this was a nes shebechutz la'aretz, a nes that took place, a salvation, and a very outstanding event, to be sure, but something that happened in Chutz La'aretz, which means that it is not part of the, shall we call it, the norm, or what should be the norm for the Jewish people. The norm should be the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael and going about their business according to the Torah, and growing and developing their culture, their civilization based on that Torah. That should be what Am Yisrael is all about. Galuth is an aberration. Because it's an aberration, we can't celebrate it fully, and therefore we do not say Hallel. What we do instead, says the Gemara, is we read the Megillah. Because on the other hand, even though we cannot say Hallel, we also cannot ignore the event. This was an amazing, and as we will see, a very profound event, which carries with it a message that we must internalize and remember always, for all generations, for all time. Not as this well-intentioned Jew said to me that it's irrelevant. It's not irrelevant. It's very relevant on the one hand. It's true. It was set in a certain historical setting. It took place in a certain time and place, and the outcome was such that it did not bring about a total renewal and complete recalibration of the Jewish people's reality. True, but it did carry with it a very real and meaningful message, and it saved the Jewish people in simple words, in simple terms. The Jewish people were about to be annihilated. That's one point that we can make, and it's a very relevant point. Another point that we can and should note is the very interesting statement that we find in the Talmud Yerushalmi, in the Sechet Megillah, which is the first source on your source sheet. Rabbi Yohanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. A discussion is quoted between two of the greatest HaRaayon of the second generation HaRaayon in Eretz Israel. Rabbi Yohanan Amar HaNevi'im v'HaKetuvim Atidim Libatel. Literally, the books of the prophets and the books of the Ketuvim, the third section of the Tanakh, in the future, at some point, he doesn't specify when, will libatel, literally means will be nullified, or will be no more, or will have no importance, something like that. However, Wahameshet Sifrei Torah, the wow of Wahameshet doesn't mean and, it means but. However, Wahameshet Sifrei Torah enam atidim libatel. But the Torah, the 5 books of Moshe Rabbeinu, they will never be nullified, they will never be abrogated, they will never become irrelevant. Mata'ama, and on what can Rabbi Yohanan base this statement that the Torah itself is for all time, it's forever? Kol gadol u'lo yasaf. That is the pasuk that we find in the Torah, referring to Matan Torah. The Torah was given, as we know, with Kolot and Barakim. There was a light show, there was tremendous events and lightning, thunder, and powerful sounds that emanated from Har Sinai, as described in the Torah. And one of the things the Torah says about the giving of the Torah was it was a kol gadol v'lo yasaf. And Onkelos translates the word lo yasaf means Volat Pasek, which means it does not end. In other words, the Torah is given and it continues for all time. There's no ending to it. So therefore, Rabbi Yohanan says the Torah is for all time. Lo yasaf. It will never, the sound of the Torah, the giving of the Torah, that act of Hashem is an ongoing creative act of the giving of the Torah to Israel and the continued existence and the study of the Torah in Am Yisrael for all time. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish disagrees on one or two small points with this statement of Rabbi Yohanan. He says, Af Megillat Esther, that's one thing. V'halachot, that's the second thing. Enam atidim libatel. These two will never become irrelevant, will never be forgotten, or will never become unnecessary. Megillat Esther and halachot. Halachot refers to the essential halachot of the Torah Sheba'al Peh, which instruct us how to put the Torah into practice, how to implement the Torah. These two, says Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, these will never be undone, these will never become irrelevant. How does he learn this? From the pasuk, Ne'emar kan kol gadol v'lo yasaf, the same pasuk that Rabbi Yohanan mentioned. It says here regarding the Torah, kol gadol v'lo yasaf, and it says in Megillat Esther regarding Purim and the reading of the Megillah, where in Megillat Esther was Zichram lo yasuf mizaram. Here it says lo yasaf, here it says lo yasuf. Yasuf here also means will not end. In the Megillah, when it says that the days of Purim, the celebration of Purim, and the message of Purim, that's what we're discussing now, this will never end. This will constantly be celebrated and learned and studied and internalized by the Jewish people, which is also, therefore, a direct answer to that young man who called me and asked me, why do we have to celebrate this Golistic festival? The truth is, he has a point on the one hand. Chazal also knew that there wasn't a perfect ness, so to speak, but on the other hand, things are not black and white. Many things are not black and white. This too is not black and white. There is something very powerful and very profound about Purim, about the message of Purim, the events of Purim. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, just as the Torah, the Hamisha Chumshei Torah, will never be batel, so will Megillat Esther not be batel. And this is an amazing statement when you think about it. Why? Because of all the books that we know in the Tanakh today, which book is, you could say in some regards, the least authoritative or the least important? We know that the book of Esther does not mention Hashem once. And we see in the Gemara, we learn in the Gemara, that there was a mahaloket amongst the Chachamim, even up to the time of the HaRaayon, whether Megillat Esther is actually considered part of the Tanakh or not. That may seem surprising to you, but Shmuel, one of the greatest Amoraim, the first generation of the Amoraim, says that in his view, Megillat Esther is not part of Kitvei HaKodesh. Why is this relevant? He doesn't mean to say that Purim shouldn't be celebrated. He does not mean that we do not read the Megillah on Purim. He was quite certain that we have to, of course, but it has certain halachic ramifications. There are certain halachot that pertain to Kitvei HaKodesh, books that are defined as Kitvei Kodesh, part of the Tanakh, and some of those halachot do not apply to, would not apply therefore to Megillat Esther, according to Shmuel. It has nothing to do with the question of whether you have to read it once a year, but it's a record of something that happened that we must remember, yes, but it's not really part of Kitvei HaKodesh. So Shmuel holds, and there were Tanaim who held this before him. But the consensus, the majority view was that it is part of Kitvei HaKodesh. But the fact that a book that some of the Chachamim thought was not part of Kitvei HaKodesh, it's dafka such a book that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says, this book will never be batel, not Yirmiyahu, about which there was no discussion, not Yeshayahu, not Sefer Malachim. But this book, that's very surprising, and that's something we need to understand. The other point that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish makes is that the essential parameters and teachings of the Torah Shebaal Peh are also something that are cannot never be forgotten, can never be reformed or changed. But they're not batel at any time. They are with us for all time. And how does he learn that? Halachot, he says, because there's a pasuk. The word halichot olam lo. There's a pasuk which can, the word halichot is close to the word halachot. It's obviously an asmachta, which means it's not a direct limud, but he means to say that Torah Shebaal Peh is also the essential foundation of the Torah Shebaal Peh, not every minhag or every opinion that ever was stated by someone, but the essential parameters of the Torah Shebaal Peh are an essential part of the Torah and part of the Jewish people's life for all time. That is a statement that we find in the Talmud Yerushalmi Masechet Megillah. And this statement requires an explanation. So let us begin by trying to understand it. Let us begin by looking at the second source on the source sheet, which is from the Rambam, Hilchot Megillah, the end of the second chapter of Hilchot Megillah. Here, the Rambam, based on this statement of the Talmud Yerushalmi, the Rambam states the following. He says, Kol Sifrei HaNevi'im V'chol HaKetuvim, all the books of the Tanakh, apart from the Torah itself, Atidim Libatel Yimot HaMashiach. First of all, we learn something from the Rambam, before we even continue. In the Talmud Yerushalmi it said, Atidim Libatel, in the future there will be Batel, according to Rabbi Yohanan. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish agreed, which is also strange, we have to understand. There's no mahloket between Rabbi Yohanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, that all the Nevi'im and all the Ketuvim will be batel, except for one thing, Megillat Esther. On that there was a disagreement. The rest they agree on. So what does that mean? One day there'll be no Tanakh, we won't be the Tanakh, we'll go to all the Sifrei Tanakh in the Gnizah, and that'll be the end of it. That's a very unusual step. It needs to be understood. The Rambam first of all explains that when these Chachamim and the Yerushalmi discuss something that will be in the future, they're referring to Yimot HaMashiach. That's number one. Because that's what the Rambam paraphrases this discussion, and he says, Kol Sifrei HaNevi'im V'chol HaKetuvim Atidim Libatel Yimot HaMashiach. Chos Megillat Esther. So whose view is he following? The view of Rabbi Yohanan or the view of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish? He's following the view expressed by Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Harehi kayemet kahamisha homshei Torah. The Megillah will exist for all time and will be read for all time, like the Torah itself. Uchahalachot shel Torah shebaal peh, and like all the essential parameters and framework and foundation of the Torah shebaal peh, as we explained. Sheinam betelim. These two le'olam. These two will never become batel, will never become inoperative or irrelevant. And even though all the other trials and tribulations that the Jewish people had to suffer throughout history, will eventually be forgotten. In other words, in the future, when Malchut HaMashiach, Malchut Beit David is re-established, and the Jewish people are sitting safely and at peace in their land, and are able to, as the Rambam described at the end of the Machon, that the reason we look forward to Yom Mashiach is so that we will be able to live in peace and tranquility, and study the Torah, and not be disturbed by evildoers of different types, from different sources of the world. Even all the trials and difficulties and tragedies will be one day forgotten. Shene'emar, as it says in Yeshayahu, Ki nishkachu atzaroth harishonot, v'chi nisteru me'enai. All the original tragedies and difficulties will be one day forgotten, says Yeshayahu. Nevertheless, says Rambam, Yemei Purim, lo yibatalu, dafka, the remembrance of Purim will never be forgotten. What was and what was about to happen, the annihilation of the Jewish people, as planned by Haman, that will never be forgotten. Shene'emar v'yemei Purim ha'eleh, as it says in the Megillah, lo ya'avru mitoch HaYehudi. It will not be forgotten. V'zichram lo yasuf mizar'am, will be remembered for all time. So says the Rambam. So what can we understand from this statement of the Rambam, who has now paraphrased for us the original statement in the Talmud Yerushalmi? He's expanded it a bit, but he still has left us with a challenge. We have to still work at this before we really understand it. Rambam tells us on the one hand, Purim is very unique, it's very special. He doesn't really explain why it's special, why it's unique, why all the other tragedies and the Galuyot, etc., everything will be one day forgotten. They won't be necessary to be reminded of them. But Purim, of all those things that happened to the Jewish people over thousands of years, Dafka Purim will never be forgotten. That has to be constantly mentioned and celebrated year in, year out. Rambam hasn't explained why, but he states that's the fact. He also told us that all the Nevi'im and all the Ketuvim will be Batelim in the time of the Mashiach. Now what are we to do with such a statement? How can we imagine that the Sefer Yeshayahu or Sefer Tehillim or anything, any book you choose to mention in the Tanakh, that all these things will somehow be Batel? What does that mean? Now this is not only a question that occurs to us, it occurred to many Chachamim, including the Ravad. The Ravad, who often comments on things that the Rambam says. He writes here as follows, and he writes with his usual sharp tongue. He writes, Devar het yutofu zeh. This is an empty, foolish statement. This is what it says. Devar het yutofu zeh. He thought the Rambam was to be taken literally. Presently we'll see, I believe that that's not correct. But he took the Rambam at face value. He says, the Rambam says that these things will be batel. That's not right. He says, Ki lo yibatel sefer mikol sefarim. She'en sefer, she'en bo limud. That's not true. Not one book of the Tanakh will ever be batel. All the books of the Tanakh, every pasuk in the Tanakh is precious and has great wisdom, and from it we can learn many things. We must therefore always learn the Tanakh. We can't imagine Judaism and Talmud Torah without studying the Tanakh. How could that ever be? Aval kach amaru. What Rabbi said, I will tell you what the Chachamim meant when they said this statement. Afilu yibatlu shal sefarim v'likrot bahem. Even if a time comes, probably he means to say in Yom HaMashiach, when again all the tragedies and galuyot, etc., will be forgotten, and the more these things are forgotten, the less many of the statements in the Nevi'im, many of the Parshiot in the Nevi'im, the less they become relevant to us. Because if Nevi'im, specific Nevi'im, spoke about certain events that will happen in the future, and they also spoke about the Galut, and they spoke about the Geulah, once that is all behind us, it's less relevant by the very nature of the thing. As long as we are waiting for these events to take place, it's relevant, it's important. But once it's happened, it's history, and therefore becomes less important. Therefore the Ravad says it's true. Even if certain books in the Tanakh, or all the books, will become books that are no longer read, or, as we'll see that I'll mention in a moment, read in public, perhaps we might say. The Megillah lo tibatel melikot tzibur. That's what the Rabbi is getting at. He says, it's true, a time will come, based on this statement in the Yerushalmi, which the Rabbi is not rejecting, that to read what Yeshayahu predicted about Yemot HaMashiach will no longer be something that you have to read in the Haftarah in Shul. You could ask me, so what will we read for the Haftarah in Shul? I don't know right now. I haven't figured that out yet. But actually, I do have an answer. I saw an answer to that question on Shabbat. If I have time, I'll mention it. You won't have to read all those nevuot once they've already taken place. Once these events have played out, it will be less important to read them with Sibur. Today, when we read what Yeshayahu says about the Geula and about the Galut before and what will happen afterwards, etc., it's very relevant. We need to, first of all, it encourages us. It's a great encouragement, a nechama for the Jewish people to hear that this Galut is not going to be forever. There's an end to this. This is what kept Jews going throughout history. A time will come when this is no longer true, says the Rabbi, yes, but it will never be true about Megillat Esther. This will always have to be read b'tzibur. What's he referring to? The reading of the Megillah on Purim, once a year, it has to be read. In other words, this is something Jewish people always have to hear. They always have to know, and always remember. So what has the Rabbi actually done? He hasn't disagreed with the Rambam about the importance, the centrality of Purim and the reading of the Megillah on Purim every year. And he doesn't disagree with what the Yerushalmi says either, that the Rambam based himself on. He says, don't understand from that statement that all the books of the Tanakh will one day be put in the Gizah, be batel, the Gamba, as if they have no use for us any longer. That's not true. Every pasuk in the Tanakh is of great value to us, and we'll always learn them. But the burning importance, the necessity to read them in public and to tell the Jewish people what the Nevi'im prophesy for the future, that will become less acute as time goes on, as Malchut HaMashiach appears and develops and evolves, and the Jewish people move on. As we know, time causes us to forget things, causes things to recede into the past, in our memory, and then become less important. So the Ravad has disagreed only with one point, and that is, do not think that the intention of the Yerushalmi was that some parts of the Tanakh will just be forgotten. Not true. So says the Ravad. So what do we have before us? On the face of it, we have the Rambam who says they will be forgotten. And the Ravad says they won't be forgotten. Which is a very difficult thing to accept. How could the Rambam say such a thing? Is that what he really thought? That Sefer Yeshayahu, Sefer Tehillim, Sefer Yoshua, or actually about Yoshua, you could argue that was not included in the statement about all the books of the Tanakh being forgotten. But we find in the Gemara the statement that had Am Yisrael not sinned and had there not been all kinds of problems along the way, then it would have been sufficient for the Jewish people to receive the Torah and Sefer Yoshua, and that would have been telling us about the entrance to Eretz Yisrael, and that would have been the end of it. There would have been nothing else to discuss. All the rest happened, came into being, was written down and recorded because of what we didn't do correctly and how things played out as a result of our shortcomings. But with regards to the rest of the Tanakh, could the Rambam really have thought such a thing? I believe the Rambam did not think such a thing and did not, there's no real argument here, there's no real machloket between the Rambam and the Ravad. The Ravad took the Rambam at his word, but the Rambam is not to be taken at his word, just as Chazal can't be taken at their word. In other words, when Rabbi Yochanan says, all the Ketuvim, all the Nevi'im will be B'telim, does that make sense? As the Ravad himself pointed out. The Ravad also says you can't take that at face value. You have to interpret it, you have to understand what was being meant, what was being said here. In the same way, you have to understand the Rambam in exactly the same fashion, and therefore really there's no real difference between what the Rambam and the Ravad are saying. And how do I explain this? When we say that something is batel, or that something is going to be forgotten, it doesn't mean necessarily that it will be totally forgotten. That will be mamash batel. It will cease to exist, as it were. No. What we mean often is that something which was much more central and important to us will, at a different time in history, become less important. It won't be forgotten, but it won't be center stage. And that's exactly what we find in the third source, which is also from the Talmud Yerushalmi, which is, and also the fourth source, it's essentially the same source. It also appears in Talmud Bavli, the end of the first parak of Brachot. We have in the Mishnah, you can look at the source number 3 or 4, we have the Mishnah. The Mishnah is quoted in number 4, more specifically. We have the Mishnah, Maskirim Yisiyat Mitzrayim Balilov. Right? Everyone knows this Mishnah from the Haggadah Shel Pesach, correct? We are to mention, this refers to the Bracha after Kriyat Shema in the evening, that we are required to mention Yisiyat Mitzrayim in the Bracha Emet V'Yatziv or Emet V'Emunah that comes after Kriyat Shema in the evening, just as we do in the morning. That's what the Mishnah refers to. Maskirim Yisiyat Mitzrayim Balilot. אמר רבי אלעזר בן עזריה, הרי אני כבן 70 שנה, ולא זכיתי שתאמר או שאשמע, שתאמר יציאת מצרים בלילות. I never understood why this was so. עד שדרשה בן זומא, until I heard בן זומא explain, שנאמר למען תזכור את יום צאתך מארץ מצרים כל ימי חייך, so that you shall remember the day that you left Mitzrayim, all the days of your life. ימי חייך הימים, כל ימי חייך הלילות. Ben Zoma explained that in this pasuk we see that you have to remember Kol Yemei Hayach, which includes night just as it includes day, and therefore every day twice you have to remember and mention Yetziat Mitzrayim. The Chachamim say in response to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, or rather to Ben Zoma, Chachamim Omorim Yemei Hayach Olam Hazeh Kol Yemei Hayach Rabbi Yemot HaMashiach. No, or not, they don't actually disagree. It's not that the Chachamim think you don't have to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim. They say there's something beyond that we learn from this pasuk. That even in the future, when everything is rosy, when again, which refers to Yemot HaMashiach, when everything is in place as it should be, even then we are required to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. Even then we will have to mention Yetziat Mitzrayim on a daily basis. It's not something we can ever forget. But that's not the end of the discussion. What we have now, both in 3 and 4, one's the Yerushalmi, one's the Tosefta, it's essentially the same source. I'm reading now from the source number 4. Amar lahem ben Zoma, he said to the Chachamim, V'chi maskim Yetziat Mitzrayim b'Yemot HaMashiach. Are you telling me that in the time of the Mashiach, when everything is fine and wonderful, we will have to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim? V'alo kvar ne'eman, does it not state in the pasuk? L'chen hinei yamim ba'im nu Adonai. There are days coming, behold, there are days coming, says Hashem. V'lo ya'amer od. It will no longer be said that Hashem, who took the children of Israel out of Mitzrayim, lives. Rather, it will be said that Hashem, the living God, is He who took the Jewish people out of the present Galut, out of the last Galut, and brought them back to Eretz Yisrael. In other words, what does that pasuk say? That Yetziat Mitzrayim will no, that's what Ben Zoma understood, it will no longer be necessary to remember and to mention it. What we will talk about and mention all the time is the more recent events of the last Galut and the exit from that Galut back to Eretz Yisrael. The Chachamim responded to him and said, Amru lo, lo shete'akeh Yetziat Mitzrayim mimkoma. It doesn't. You should not understand from that pasuk that the mentioning and the remembrance of Mitzrayim, of Yetziat Mitzrayim, will be forgotten altogether in the time of the Mashiach. For example, can you imagine that we would not celebrate Pesach? How can you have Yahadut? Can you have Torah without Pesach? Without Chametz and Matzah? Without a Korban Pesach? Is that possible? It doesn't make any sense. It can't be. These are essential mitzvot in the Torah. All the Torah, the mitzvot, are for all time. So how can you say such a thing? Of course, Yetziat Mitzrayim will be remembered. It won't be forgotten. Ela shetehei Yetziat Mitzrayim musaf al malchuyot. Malchuyot ikar. Yetziat Mitzrayim tefela. Remembering Yetziat Mitzrayim, which took place thousands of years ago, and is, let's be honest, is a distant memory, but it's a memory that we refuse to let go of, and we mustn't let go of, because the Torah tells us always to remember it. But who else, apart from the Jewish people, could remember such things that happened thousands of years ago? We have this knack for remembering things that took place a long, long time ago. And the Torah instructs us to do so, for sure. But it's only human nature that which took place yesterday will be much fresher in your memory than that which took place thousands of years ago, or in the lifespan of a human human being. That which took place last week, we fresh in your memory that something took place 35 years ago, correct? For sure.
Usually.
So the Chachamim say to Ben Zoma, we agree with you that Yetziat Mitzrayim has to be mentioned at night, and we also are telling you there has to be mentioned B'mot HaMashiach. And that surprised Ben Zoma. He said, I read in the Pasuk that there will come a time when Yetziat Mitzrayim will be no longer talked about. And they say, no, it doesn't mean it won't be talked about. It won't be spoken about in the same way as the more recent events will be spoken about, because those events will be much more alive, much more real, much more relevant, because we were in the Galut and this happened, and we didn't know how we were going to get out of it, and here we are today, and this is something that we remember, it's closer to us. And therefore, Yetziat Mitzrayim becomes tafel, takes a secondary role next to the Geula from the Malchiyot, from the later times of Galut. So what do we see in these sources? We see that when Chazal sometimes speak about something being batel or being forgotten, when the Pasuk even says that there will come a time when people will not say Hashem lives, the God who took Am Yisrael from Mitzrayim, but rather they will say Hashem lives, He who took Am Yisrael out of the recent Galut. Even when the Pasuk says so, you don't understand. You should not understand from that Yetziat Mitzrayim is no more, not to be remembered. Pesach is not important. We don't have to read the Torah about Yetziat Mitzrayim. Not at all. We will have to mention it every day in our tefillah. We'll never forget it. But it will not be as central for us and as meaningful to us as something which happened much more recently. And that's something that's how human beings are. We always are drawn and affected more by that which happened in our own experience or in the experience of recent generations. What means more to us today? What do we discuss more today? What do we mourn more today? The Shoah, the Holocaust, or the Chmielnicki massacres 400 years ago? Almost 400 years ago. That was also a terrible tragedy. And a huge number, many Jews, huge numbers of Jews were massacred. But that which happened more recently is closer to us, not only because of the numbers involved, that too, but also simply because it's more alive, it's closer to us. We know people who were there. That is the answer to all these questions about the Rambam and the Ravad and the Yerushalmi. What was meant by the Nevi'im that the Ketuvim will be batel? No one meant to say that we really batel. What was intended was that the immediacy of the subject matter in those writings, the urgency to remember and read them all the time, in public,